We are coming now to unit number 3 in our course on Introduction to Ethics, where we'll be considering the ethical theories of Plato in relation to deontological ethics, with a focus on his view on duty. Today, as we move into our discussion of Plato's view of deontological ethics, we're going to begin first with a reflection on the textbook and its relationship to the videos, which is a matter which will come up on a number of occasions because, well, we'll talk about that when we come to it. I'm going to give you an initial definition of deontological ethics, the whole theory of it, as an overview, but with a focus today on Plato. We'll come back to deontological ethics again, for example, when we study Kant. At this point, our focus is going to be first upon Plato's view of moral goodness and his view of reason being the basis for establishing any ethical theory or value theory. And then we'll look at the bigger picture of his views and his ethical theory. And we'll come back at the end and focus on summarizing Plato's deontological ethics. But first, let's turn our attention to the textbook. As you have been going through the syllabus and seeing the assignments, you'll see that in relation to unit number 3, there really is a very small section of reading in chapter 5 of the textbook. You're going to discover as you're making your way through this course that the textbook and these videos, while complementary one to the other, these videos and my lectures to you are going to follow a somewhat different approach to that of the textbook. I'm going to be first looking at classical Western approaches to the study of ethics, and then moving on to look at the modern Western approaches to the study of ethics. Now, I'll cover fundamentally the same material as a textbook, but from a different perspective, and hopefully these differences will enrich your study. And this is particularly significant in relation to chapter 5 of the textbook and this particular unit. I've only assigned you a short reading. It focuses on the textbook's critique of the divine command theory. Now, again, we'll come back to this divine command theory and religion and morality later on in this course. But in this video, I wanted you to have the background of reading the textbook's view of the divine command theory, but I particularly want in this particular video to take a different approach, because like the textbook, we'll be looking at Euthyphro's discussion of virtue. That's where Socrates meets Euthyphro and they discuss what is virtue, what is just, what is morally right. It's in that discussion that I want to draw to your attention that Plato has a passion for following Socrates' argument that reason and reason alone should be the basis for defining virtue and justice and duty. In other words, the foundation for ethics. And it's indeed this passion for reason which is at the heart of not only Plato's thinking as a whole, but also for his view of deontological ethics. And again, we'll come back to that when we come to Kant and some others. We'll hit deontological ethics a couple more times in the future. Well, what in the world is deontological ethics? Well, the word deontological applies primarily to the study of ethics and to that branch called deontological ethics. It comes from two Greek words, deon meaning to bind and logos meaning word. To be bound by reason, to be bound by something. In this sense, it's a duty-based approach to ethics. But to be bound by something, hence the logos part of the definition, that is not arbitrary, that is not subjective, but rather it is based upon reason. And in this sense, it's to be distinguished from things like utilitarianism. But deontological ethics has different approaches, and there may be it may be possible to argue there are different subdivisions than the ones I've given you here, but primarily we have three groups of approaches to deontological ethics. there's the mixed group. In other words, it fundamentally focuses on a duty but considers the consequences of a specific duty. In other words, it's not as absolutely bound, the dion, bound to the ontology. Essentialism, which is really Plato's view, the right, the just, or the good is grounded in some abstract idea or form, or a rational concept or principle, and which is followed rigorously, both in its application and understanding. And then there's voluntarism, also known as divine command theory, which you're being introduced to in the textbook. The right, the just, and the good is grounded in God's command, or divine revelation, if you will. And I've just added a note there that some Christians and some theists involve God giving commands, but not all voluntarists. So let's leave that at this point in time, and we'll come back again at the end and talk about that. Plato. Socrates, these ancient Greek philosophers. Well, here's a little graph for you. You can look at this at your own pleasure. You'll see that Plato is 427 to 347. You get some idea of the Peloponnesian Wars on the left-hand side of the screen, that dreadful period of conflict between Athens and Sparta, ultimately Athens being defeated by Sparta, a dreadful loss of life, the consequence to Athens during the war and after the war was governments being replaced and internal turmoil. Was destructive to not only the Athenians but destructive to the Spartans. That is the context in which we begin to be introduced to the work of Plato. But to understand Plato, we have to understand his great teacher Socrates. Plato, as we will see in a moment, came from a wealthy family but joined the students who followed Socrates around Athens. He became enamored with this teacher, he admired this teacher. He's going to conclude at the end of Socrates' life that he was the most noble of all men. He admired Socrates and in many respects followed his teaching. So it's worthy for us to look at this background to Plato's views. Indeed, it is the views of Socrates that shape the concept of duty and the concept and role of reason in ethics. But just pause for a moment and we'll just have a brief look at Socrates. He's quite an interesting person. On the one hand, Socrates never had a school building, never had a classroom, never wrote a book, and yet is one of the most influential philosophers in history. His influence comes through Plato, of course, but he is a most intriguing person. His work was to lead his students in a group around Athens and ask questions of the people and the students and interact with them, and he taught by what's known as the Socratic method. I'll come to more of that in a moment. But he'd studied music, he'd done gymnastics, he'd followed his father's profession as a sculptor, he served in the army with distinction, he was a war hero, he'd saved generals in battles, and toward the end of that war he was discharged and was teaching in Athens. And that's the end of the Peloponnesian Wars, coming to an end, and when Socrates is teaching and Plato is following him, and some crucial events take place at the end of Socrates' life, which change everything. Now this Socratic method by which he taught could be very stinging and very painful. In a moment I'll show you an example of it, so you'll see it more than have it described to you. But the leadership in Athens after the Peloponnesian Wars was a weak form of democracy, almost an oligarchy, very nervous and very concerned with Plato's questionings, because his questionings stung and they threatened the Athenian leaders. Well, how could it sting? Well, let's pause for a moment and let Socrates perform for us, and we'll see him in action.
Come set up shop here. He's made me work twice as hard.
So you say Simmias here is your enemy because he makes you work harder than you did before?
Wasn't that enough to make any man your enemy?
But an enemy is a man who does you evil, isn't he?
Any fool knows that.
And a friend is one who does you good.
Any fool knows that, too.
But what a fool does not know is what is good and what is evil. Now, you make better vases and you work harder because of Simmias' competition. Do you not?
To find oneself in a debate or dialogue with Socrates was to find oneself being taken down a pathway which begins with you being the expert and Socrates being the fool or the one who knew nothing, to a point through various questions, as you saw in the video, being asked, reaching a point where, in the end, you who were the wise one are shown by your own answers that you know nothing. And that stings. So it's not surprising that the democratic group of leaders who had been elected in Athens after the Peloponnesian War found Socrates a bitter pill to swallow. In that political uncertainty and unrest, they brought two charges against him. That he didn't believe in the gods of the city, and that he was corrupting the morals of the young. We're not going to concern ourselves very much with this, other than simply use it as background to help ourselves understand Plato's deontological ethics. You can see from the map here, this is a stylized map of Athens in the 5th century BC. The arrow points to the law courts, and as you've already noted, that he was before a jury of 500. They gathered in that building, and eventually by a small majority he was convicted of both offences. But before we get to the actual trial, a very important discussion takes place between Socrates and Euthyphro. Euthyphro is a priest, and he meets Socrates as Socrates and he are approaching those same law courts. Euthyphro is there for a very strange reason. He's there because he was going to bring charges against his own father for murdering a slave. And Euthyphro is wanting to uphold the law and its importance. And he believes that it's not right that his father should be able to murder that slave and walk away from it. So it's his duty to bring a charge against his own father. And Socrates asks him why that is something he must do. And Euthyphro wants to argue that that's the pious, just, and right thing to do. So much of this little dialogue between Socrates and Euthyphro is about piety. What is just, what is right. And at the heart of Euthyphro's argument is that the gods want to say something is good, and when they agree that something is good, something is just, something is moral, well, then it is because they have said it is. And there's a sense in which Socrates' discussion with him says, well, let's think about this using reason, and reason alone. That's very important at this point in time. If you use something else other than reason, then the whole discussion comes into doubt. That is the discussion led by Socrates. And perhaps the question set out in blue on this screen can help you here. Socrates is saying, is something pious because the gods say it is so? Now, Euthyphro says, yes. On the other hand, he says, is something pious because it's pious? Now, what Socrates wants to show is that if it's true that something's holy, something's pious because the gods say it is so, then that's just simply an arbitrary based on their reason or something they've reasoned. And that's rather arbitrary. And if it's true, because it's true, then it's a circular argument. And so what he is doing here is he is showing that piety can't depend upon the gods. Now, if you knew about the Greek pantheon and the behaviour of the various Greek gods in the Greek pantheon, you perhaps understand why Socrates is saying, surely this bunch of characters cannot be the basis of what is pious and what is good. They change their mind, they're radical, they're tempestuous, they're involved with sex, they're involved in all kinds of things. But as far as the city is concerned, that's a very serious issue. And what Socrates is going to ultimately argue is that you have to have a rational basis for saying something is just, something is pious, and something is right. We'll come back to that. We turn our attention now to the actual trial, and our focus is more on the punishment portion of the trial. You'll recall that the jury of 500 was hearing the case. By a small margin of 30, he was convicted. And it's been said that he was his own worst enemy in his defence at the primary part of the trial when he was facing the charges. He persisted in the kind of Socratic method of questioning which may have been clever but not persuasive for a jury. Miletus, the prosecutor, was effective and demanded the death penalty. Now, Socrates has to respond, and it's interesting because in this response we see his, if you like, stubborn commitment to what is the case, what is the truth, what is the just conclusion. He's being asked, now that he's been convicted, to come up with a suggestion of penalty. And he poses the question again, typically Socratic style. Well, what is the penalty you should give to an innocent person? And he concludes that it's only just that you connect the crime and the punishment. And if he's innocent, then justice demands not a penalty, but a benefit. And that's when he sarcastically suggests that the punishment he should get is he should be fed at the Praetorium. And that amounts to free lunch at City Hall for the rest of his life. That was a thing that was given to the Olympic champions. You can understand the jury was unimpressed. He's supposed to cover 3 options: death, other than death, imprisonment, a fine, or exile, banishment from the city. Now, he refuses to come up with any of those. He insists free lunches at City Hall. And he concludes with a very famous statement where he says, I'm going to continue asking questions no matter what, because the unexamined life is not worth living. He decided what the good life was, he was sticking to it, and the justice demanded he should follow through on it. Now, it's in that regard, after he's been convicted and the death sentence has been passed upon him, that we find him in the jail. He's surrounded by his friend Crito, lifelong friend, by Plato, and by other close friends. And it's there that Crito suggests to Socrates that he needs to flee, impose self-banishment, banishment upon himself, and run away. And Socrates explains that he will not run away. He says that it would be impious to run away. It wouldn't be virtuous. It would be a moral wrong. And he has 2 very interesting reasons for this. And this is where we see his view of duty coming through. There are other interesting quotes. They're quoted from the Crito. This theory of awkwardness as we look at them in English. He says, look at the first one, do you think it possible for a city not to be destroyed if the verdicts of its courts have no force, but are nullified and set at naught by private individuals. He views his running away as destroying the city, because it's destroying the authority that the city has imposed. Now, just think for a moment. Our cities impose speed limits on us. And Socrates is arguing that to violate those laws, speed laws for example, is destroying the city. And there is a sense in which you could argue that speed causes accidents, people get killed, it's disruptive to the city and so on. But it's a pretty strong argument. It destroys the city. But there's a converse to that. The citizen's duty is to obey. He's insisting that one does not have the right to disobey the orders of the state. He puts it this way, it's the second quote. Your country is to be honoured more than your mother, your father, and all your ancestors. One must obey the commands of one's city and country, or persuade it as to the nature of justice. He was not able to persuade it to the nature of justice, and accordingly he must pay the price. So we see here that Socrates is teaching Plato the importance of duty, to obey the law, and there can be no compromise. We can also see in these debates the profound importance of rational establishing of what is virtuous, good, and right. As an aside, you may have seen these pictures. This is by Louis David, Jacques-Louis David, The Death of Socrates. Many artists have painted this scene in various ways. Of course, we could take a time to identify the people who were there. Jacques-Louis David has tried to identify them. Socrates is obviously about to drink the Hamlet. We won't go into all of those things. But it certainly has been a powerful for freedom of speech. A powerful statement for freedom of speech. And yet, it's at the same time a powerful argument for the dictatorship of the state, which is fascinating itself. But with that background in mind, let's turn our attention to Plato. I'll leave you to look at this slide and see the details of his life. He, of course, was the successor to Socrates. He took over the academy, even though it wasn't really a school as such. He was profoundly influential in promoting, firstly, his teacher's views, Socrates' views, and then his own, sometimes called the Socratic problem. As you read the dialogues of Plato, where are you hearing Socrates, where are you hearing Plato? They seem to be merged together, and probably ever will be. But Plato is the great systematic mind who put things together in order, and published and wrote extensively. And again, he begins with the question, what is the good life? Now, for Socrates, it was the unexamined life is not worth living. Plato has a slightly different answer. He says, the good life is where your soul can exist in harmony. And the soul, he says, has three parts. There's the rational part, there is the emotional part, the psychological part, if you will, the personality part, and then, of course, the appetitive part, where you have bodily concerns, the soul's concerned about keeping the body going, etc. And he says that the living in harmony, that is internal harmony, the harmony of the three parts of the soul, that's where you're having the good life. Now that's going to become important because when you look at his view of freedom and justice, quite clearly freedom and justice has to be more, for the individual, has to be more internal than external. And so it's not surprising that he's perfectly happy with this view of the good life. A person's personal and social life should be lived in accordance with virtue. That is, living in a relationships of justice. And if you reflect upon the Credo, Virtue is something that can be taught, it's objective, and it's binding, even on the gods. Virtue is what the gods will approve and value. That's because they know what it is. Obey the laws and decisions of the state, or convince the state of the justice of your views. And civil disobedience is not virtuous. Indeed, not permitted. And in this context, he has a view of the human person. And it's an interesting one. He views people as being morally neutral, as needing to be taught the form of justice and virtue. And evil, because we're morally neutral, is a manifestation of ignorance. And he sees every person as having free will and the freedom to choose virtue. He even goes further than that. He asserts that it's good to be good, because when you're good, the three parts of your soul are living in harmony. He gives this wonderful story in the Republic about the ring of Gyges. It's a ring, if you put your finger and turn it, you could become invisible. What would you do if you were invisible and couldn't be seen and could you commit a crime? And he said it's good to be good. And you want to be the same, visible and invisible. He has a very famous statement: good people do not need laws to tell them to act responsibly, while bad people will always find a way round the laws. His political theory flows out of this view of the harmony of the individual, the harmony of soul, in its rational, psychological personality, if you will, and appetitive bodily needs. And he structures the state that way. The state to be ruled by philosopher kings and queens, the spirit of a community to be kept in order by the guardians. These are the police and the army, if you will. And everyone else fits into that third level. And he sees that society needs to be run by philosopher kings and queens. And he has this statement, which is interesting. He says, till philosophers become rulers of this world, or till those we now call kings and rulers really and truly become philosophers, there'll be no end of trouble. And so he sees it important for philosophers to rule. In other words, people who really know what is just and true, that's his philosopher kings and queens, they're the ones who have this innate knowledge of what is the right thing to do in every circumstance. And they're the ones who can make all the decisions. That spirit of leadership is needed for the good of the community. I've given you a little diagram here, puts his three theories of metaphysics, epistemology and value theory together. You can look over those for yourselves. You'll see that his highest value is justice, and everything is lived in relation to that. This little summary sheet gives you how society worked. This view of society is set out in his famous work called The Republic. I've already referred to the first two bullet points. In this society, everyone did what they had to do, what the philosopher kings and queens said. And the philosopher kings and queens always agreed because they all knew with certainty what was just and right in every situation, because they understood these objective concepts of justice, or this objective concept of justice, out of which they could apply that principle of justice evenly and justly to everybody. They saw the importance of a curriculum of education. And once you have a curriculum of education, by definition, you're going to have some form of censorship, because something's going to be included and something's excluded. But men and women are equal. It's a fascinating book to read in terms of the first utopia in history, at least in Western literature, where men and women are absolutely equal. And some incredible consequences come because of it. He believes that it's the task of the leaders of the Republic, the philosopher kings and queens, to engage in what's called the noble lie, telling people that their place in society has been determined by the gods, whether they are philosopher kings and queens, whether they are to be guardians, or whether they are to be humble folks in all the other areas of life. He's radically a feminist. For example, he believes that the stumbling block for women to be fully involved in society, the thing that's holding women back, is in fact child rearing and child caring. And so he removes that from women. That's handed to the professional nurses so that women can be fully involved in every level and every area. His fascinating view of property. Those who have power can't own property, and those who don't have power can. Those who can't have money and spend it, the philosopher kings and queens, they rule. And those who can have property and money have it. Those who have money don't rule, and those who rule don't have money. Interesting. I won't go into any more of that. It's just a fascinating background to show the picture. So let's then put together a summary of his deontological views. First and foremost, virtue, justice, and the good are forms or concepts. They are concepts that are rationally known, they're objective, they don't change. They're known by all, but especially by the philosopher kings and queens who rule the state. This will take us to a whole discussion of innate ideas. I don't want to go down that path. All that matters for us is that the leadership's decisions and control was to be rational, orderly, and absolute. In other words, their commands carry the duty to obey, hence deontological. According to the Socratic view set forth by Plato, obedience to the state was a moral duty. Now I'll give you a little question to think about. Which of the three forms of deontology, which we talked about above, mixed, essentialism, or voluntarism, which do you think was Plato's? But reflect upon the deontological ethics of Mr. Plato. Reason's paramount, duty is at the core, and while Plato saw the individual as free and had the desire and to some extent the ability to choose virtue, personal free choice was limited to complying with virtue, as virtue was handed down by the philosopher kings and queens. In his perfect utopia, the Republic, freedom of choice for citizens was not a core value. Rather, the core value was order and justice and reason. It's an interesting combination. All right, here's what you need to know. I'll leave you to look through these. You can see what I've been going through in this particular study. Don't forget you need to keep track of things in the textbook as the reading. And so far you've had introductory reading and some chapter 5. We'll move on for unit 4. You'll have more reading there. And you'll see how the course ties together as we go on. Thank you for watching.